Okay, so now let's get started with the API gateway. So this is one of my favorite resource in AWS that I can say, because like this API gateway can be integrated to many of the AWS resources, and this is one of the main resource for like connecting it to the backend, or like the Lambda function or like the DynamoDB. So like Lambda function, API gateway, and DynamoDB, these are all the serverless resources which we have in AWS. Now let's get into this API gateway, what it is, how does it work, and what we need to keep in mind regarding API gateway. So let's get started with a simple serverless API architecture diagram. So if you take a look into this diagram, so the client is making the REST API calls to API gateway, and this API gateway is trying to like make the request to invoke AWS Lambda function, and whatever the code we have in the Lambda function, it's going to be executed, and then it's going to invoke our Amazon DynamoDB, like the AWS Lambda is going to invoke, like the API gateway will invoke the AWS Lambda. Then after, like the code in the function in the AWS Lambda is going to be executed, and then it going to make CRUD operations. Like the CRUD operations in the DynamoDB are like create, read, update, and delete operations in Amazon DynamoDB. So this is something which can be like completely built by serverless, like a serverless application, which we call it as a serverless API. It's an example of that. So now let's get started with the API gateway. So if API gateway, as we have seen in the previous example, like AWS Lambda plus API gateway or plus uh, DynamoDB, we don't need any infrastructure to manage. And the support for WebSocket, it supports like the WebSocket protocol, and it handle the API versioning like v1 and v2, and it will handle like the different environments. So like in API gateway we can create like different stages, like for the development stage, test stage, and for the prod stage. So we can assign a single Lambda function, I mean like a single Lambda function to all of these stages, and we can perform all the different tests with to these different stages, like the development stage, test stage, or the prod stage in API gateway, which is one of the very beautiful feature if we look in API gateway. And also it will handle the like authorization and authentication by using AWS Cognito user pool, or like with the identity pool. And it will like we can create API keys to handle like the request throttling. So whenever there are like high requests happening on the gate on API gateway, then we can create the API keys. And also we can use AWS secret manager and to store like the secret keys, whereas like it will transform and validate the request and responses. We can perform so many security checks with the API gateway, and this all happens in the backend. We don't know what exactly happening in the backend, but this all test can be this all is performed by the AWS API gateway, which is one of the most powerful resource to make calls in the backend, and which is more strongly secured with like the like what we say in like the DDoS protection. And we can generate SDK and API specifications. Also we can have a cache API responses with the, I mean we can also store the cache memory in, like we can also implement the elastic cache with the API gateway to decrease the load on API gateway. Now let's go to the AWS like API gateway AWS service integration. So in this, the client is sending the request to the API gateway, and the API gateway is sending the events, I mean the request, to Kinesis data stream, and those data will be stored, those records will be stored used to Amazon Data Firehose. And Amazon Data Firehose is mainly use it to store like the data in like the S3 or in relational database or in like the DynamoDB, like wherever we want to store in a physical database, we use Amazon data Firehouse. So the finally the JSON files have been stored in AWS S3. Now about the API gateway, we have the development stage, which is like making changes. As I mentioned, we have like dev stage, prod stage, and testing stage. So these are like the different kinds of development stage we can create as stages, and we can perform our test based upon our requirement by owning the configuration parameters, and test can be rolled back as a history of deployments. And also we can roll back to the previous history. I mean, like we can time travel back and we can get the history of the deployment. That's the biggest advantages of the deployment stages in API gateway. Now let's talk about the Canary deployment. Canary deployment is one of the interesting topic, and it is one of the like great way to like split the traffic to the different like different version or like a different environment. So let's say let me explain it to you in this way. So we have already we already running a production environment, and we want to like implement a new version in our production environment. We can, with the Canary deployment, after like implementing the new environment, we want to test it in the practical world. With this Canary deployment, we can split the traffic between the production environment and the testing environment. So here if you can see like the 90% of the traffic is been split to the stable version, and 10% is split to the Canary version, which is the newly deployed testing environment. So with this, we can like, instead of like splitting everything and taking our application to completely down, we can split our traffic, and we can perform like the test on the test environment. That's the biggest advantage of Canary deployment. This can be performed like, we call this as a blue green deployments. So that's the advantage of Canary deployment. This is about the API gateway Canary deployment, and thank you so much for watching this video.